Hello and welcome to the Fuel, Run, Recover podcast, helping everyday runners fuel better, run smarter, and recover faster so you can reach your full performance potential. I'm your host, Stephanie Natchuk, dietitian, fitness coach, and a fellow runner too. As the owner of Stephanie Natchuk Performance Nutrition, I've spent the last 10 years helping runners learn to fuel their bodies, level up their running performance, and establish healthier relationships with food and exercise. If you're ready to reconnect with your love of running, then let's get started on today's episode. All right, so before we get started with today's episode, I wanted to invite you to check out a few great free resources that I created just for runners. To get them, all you have to do is click on the link in the show notes or visit www.stephanienatchuk.com. If you visit my website, there's a little pop-up box that comes up and it'll prompt you to enter your email address, and these guides will be sent right to your inbox. The first guide is my fueling guide for runners. So in this resource, you'll find my top fueling tips for runners, as well as some specific meal ideas for both your pre and post-run fuel. If you've been struggling to understand what to eat when to support your running and just figuring out what those meal ideas, what those meals look like, what kind of foods you should be including before versus after you run, what the difference is between pre and post run fueling, then this guide is exactly what you need to get you started on the right path. The other guide that I created is my strength training guide for runners. So this guide includes both a PDF resource, has some tips, guidelines, and links to my YouTube series where I actually walk you through all of the exercises in the program. This is a great beginner strength training guide for runners who want an effective but efficient full body workout that helps support the key muscles and movements you need to run stronger and injury-free. So once again, both of these guides are available together. I have them put together as a little bundle for you. You can just click on the link in the show notes or go over to www.stephanienatchuk.com. Enter your email address just the one time, and both of these free guides will get sent to your inbox right away. I hope you enjoy these resources and find them helpful in supporting you and your running. And now let's get into today's episode. Welcome to today's episode, where I am excited to be talking a little bit more about your running training log. So today I wanted to share a little bit more information about what is a training log, what you should put in your training log, why you should consider keeping a training log, when to maybe consider not having a training log, and just get into some of the ins and outs of the value and sort of the time and the place for keeping this kind of data and sort of collecting this type of training information. So the first thing that I want to address is, what is a training log? And so a training log is really just a record of your training runs and a place that you can keep track and kind of keep a running record of the workouts that you do, maybe the mileage that you run, information like paces and stuff like that, as you go through the different seasons of your training and you go through your different race cycles. Why would you want to keep a training log, especially if you already have a training plan that you're following? What's the point of a training log, or sort of why keep one? And I can totally understand why it seems maybe a little bit redundant if you already have a training plan that you're following, to also need to keep track of the runs that you're doing. It's kind of like, well, I've got the plan that I'm following, so isn't that good enough to keep a record of my training runs? And in some ways, yeah, if all we need to know is the runs, the days you do the runs, your total weekly mileage that you put in, then, maybe that is going to give us a good starting point for understanding where you're at. But the value of the training log is that then we can layer on additional information. Some of it's going to be information that you get, say, from your watch or from the app that you might use for your training, information about pacing, information about maybe weather, maybe about fueling, hydration, how the run felt, your sleep. We can sort of get into a little bit more details about some of the subjective information that goes into being able to reflect and make decisions about how a training plan is going. So the reason why we would want to really keep a training log, and why I think it's a great idea for runners to keep a training log during their race training cycles, is not because we want to just be redundant and sort of be repeating ourselves from what the running training plan is telling us to do, but because we want to have an additional spot where we can keep more information, more data, add notes, add comments, add thoughts that we can then reflect on and use to make changes and use to make decisions about what we might want to do differently in the future. So, what kind of information should go into your training log? What kind of information should be stored there? Really, there's a whole big long list of things that we can keep as part of the training log data that we can collect. So, of course, the first thing we want to keep there in our training log is the actual training, the actual workout. And one of the things that I sort of like to do is to have, what was the run that was scheduled or sort of prescribed for that day? And then what did we actually do? Now, for some of you out there, for some runners, it's going to be exactly the same. There will be absolutely no difference between what was in your training plan, what the plan told you to do that day, and what you actually did. But sometimes there is going to be a little bit of a difference. And we want to be able to keep track of that and sort of keep tabs on that, so that if we're reaching a point in our training where things aren't maybe going that well, maybe we feel like we are a little bit behind schedule, if we're running into, issues with injuries or inconsistencies or whatever, we do have the ability to look back and say, well, you know what? I mean, on all these days that we're supposed to be running maybe 6, 7, 8 miles, we're actually running at a time. We're not waking up early enough, and we're running like maybe 3 or 4 miles instead of the 6 or 7 that we're supposed to be getting in. Maybe the problem is that we aren't giving ourselves, we don't have enough time in the evenings, or we're not waking up early enough, or whatever that might be. So we can kind of see like what is the expectation versus the reality of what's happening with our ability to follow that training plan. Then from there, we're able to make decisions about, do we need to change something else about our lifestyle to allow for more time to be spent on running? Maybe the problem is that we're finding on a certain day of the week, we're just way too tired to get in that speed work session. And we're really struggling to get in the speed work that we need to because we're so exhausted from the run that we did the day before. Again, it just allows us to reflect on what we're doing compared to what the plan says, and then figure out if it's pretty on track, if it's pretty on course, or if we maybe need to make some changes and make some adjustments either to what we're doing and how we're getting ourselves set up to follow the plan, or perhaps the plan itself is unrealistic and needs to change. So the first thing we want to have in our training log is information, of course, about the actual training sessions, what we did, our mileage, how long we ran for, that sort of information, pacing data, stuff like that. The other thing that we want to include in our training log are some of the other details about the day. What time of day did we go for our run? What was the weather on that day? Was it particularly hot and humid? Was it a really nice kind of cool day and really kind of our ideal running temperature? Was it super windy? Was it rainy? What was happening with the environment? And again, this allows us to reflect on not only the ability and sort of the quality of our training compared to that plan, but also then we can start to look for patterns and a deeper understanding of how different environmental conditions can impact our running on a day-to-day basis. So if we look back and we're like, oh man, 2 weeks ago I did that same loop that I ran this week, but I was way faster. Well, we can look back and we can see, yeah, maybe it was 10 or 15 degrees cooler 2 weeks ago when we did that same loop. So we can understand the different factors that are going to have an impact on our training so that we're not feeling so confused or maybe discouraged when we're not continually week after week seeing progress with our training, which isn't really the expectation anyway. Like we can't really expect that we're always just week after week going to consistently see ourselves getting better. There's always going to be ups and downs with our training, but it does really help to kind of understand what might be going on behind the scenes. It's not just us. There's a lot of other things at play. Something else I really recommend runners include in their training log is nutrition. information about your fueling. And this is everything from what you ate before you went for the run, maybe even what you ate the day before if we're talking about long run nutrition. So some information about what you ate before, what you ate during, any gels, chews, sports drinks, other snacks, whatever you had during the run. And then, of course, what you consumed afterwards. So having just an idea of your pre and post and intra-run nutrition is also really helpful if we start to see issues, if you start to have trouble with energy levels, or you're absolutely starving later on in the day, or, anything like that starts to become a problem. It's really easy to look back and say, okay, well, maybe part of the issue is that you're not having enough to eat before, during, or after your run. We can bump up those calories, and then that's going to give you the opportunity to not feel like you have all these crazy food cravings and are so starving later on. We also can really use the information around nutrition to see if we're having any issues with our digestion. So any gut problems. One of the first things that I recommend my clients do when they report that they're having issues with their digestion, whether that's after a run or during a run, they're noticing a lot of GI symptoms, keep a log of what you're eating, especially right around the time that you're running. Because one of the big factors that can contribute to GI issues for runners is choosing the wrong foods either before or during their training sessions. And so if we have these gut issues, but we don't necessarily know what we're eating, we're not kind of keeping track and looking for patterns, then it can be really difficult to kind of make changes and tease out what might be going on. So nutrition is another really important factor that I definitely recommend keeping as part of your training log. Another thing that we can keep in our training log that's really helpful is some information about our running gear. And this is helpful for, when we're running in varying weather conditions, where it's good to know if we've layered up a certain way, if we've chosen to wear, a certain piece of gear or a certain outfit or something like that. Was it appropriate for the conditions that we're running in? Now, when we're running in the summertime and it's kind of, shorts and tank top weather, it's pretty straightforward. But as we get into cooler temperatures, especially as we get into like legitimately cold weather for a lot of us heading into winter in the not so far away future, being able to layer properly for the weather conditions is really important, not only for the enjoyment and comfort of you as the runner, but also for safety. And if we're talking about running in very cold, freezing, below freezing types of weather, wind chill, all kinds of stuff like that, then it is important to just keep a note of, hey, this is what I wore and this was great, or this is what I wore and I was way too hot. This is what I wore and I was actually kind of cold. And again, if we have information about temperature, information about things like wind, rain, snow, etc., we have a record of what we wore, then we can start to just see those patterns become so much easier to make decisions. You're not standing there at your hallway closet trying to get dressed to go out for your run and you're like, wait a minute, should I wear this jacket or that jacket? I can't remember if I should put on a sweater in between my base layer and my jacket, or if I'm good without it, and what did I do last time, and all kinds of things like that. All we have to do is go flip back to the training log, and all of our notes and comments and stuff is going to be stored right there at our fingertips. We also want to include some, very subjective information of just how the run felt. How did the day go? The numbers and the paces and the weather and all of that kind of data that we can write down is great, and it can be really, really helpful for making comparisons from day to day. But I think there's also tremendous value in being able to just say, like, this run felt really good today, or this one was a struggle, or, had trouble in the last couple of miles, but felt good up until that point. It doesn't have to be a ton. Like, you don't have to write yourself a novel after every single run, but to just be able to include a few points, a few kind of key things about how the run felt, how it went, just sort of subjectively putting in a bit of that information, I think is really helpful, again, to kind of look back and to see, most of the time, are you feeling pretty good? Or are you really struggling through this training plan? Are you really kind of having a hard time getting through this training cycle? And then we can start to unpeel the layers as to why. If you're noticing that every single run or more often than not, you have maybe kind of bad things, negative things to say about the run and how it went, and you're just not feeling good, that's something that we want to address. It's something we want to tackle. But if you look back and you're like, oh, actually, you know what? I'm having a bad run like once a month or maybe twice a month or something like that. But otherwise, honestly, I'm finishing up and I'm feeling pretty good. Then we know that when you do have that off day, it's not really, setting the tone or not really the bar by which we need to measure all the other running that you're doing. But of course, because as human beings, we tend to really hyper focus and remember the bad runs, the days that didn't go so well, far more than we remember the good runs, and especially far more than we remember the ones that were just kind of the in between. We got out there, we got the mileage done. It wasn't anything special. It felt fine. It was just one of those runs that we have to go out on as part of the mileage that we do. And those are the ones that we tend to forget about the most. But if we have that subjective commentary, we have those couple of notes about those things, we go back and we look, that can sometimes give us a lot of reassurance that we are on the right track. And it can also help us see that we are having more good days than bad days. Anything else you might want to keep in your training log? Absolutely. I think hydration, kind of along with our nutrition, is a great thing to include. We can write down how much fluid we drank before, during, and after. We can keep track of even things like electrolyte consumption. There's really no end to the amount and the different types of data that you might want to put into your training run. If sleep is definitely something that impacts your training, if you find that, sleep is a bit of a struggle for you, or if you find that as you get into a training program, sometimes your sleep can be disrupted, then keeping track as well of the sleep that you're getting, how much, what time you're going to bed, what time you're waking up, things like that can also really give us a lot of value and help us to look for patterns. So with everything that I listed here, obviously I listed a ton of stuff that's going to maybe make for a very big document, a very big training log document. And so how can we organize this information? There's really no right or wrong answer. I mean, we can definitely do the old pen and paper thing, having a notebook that we just write down and keep track. A spreadsheet works really nicely as well, because in a spreadsheet, we can have different columns for all of these different topics and kind of categories. And it's really easy to update that, especially using something like a Google Doc spreadsheet. Then we're able to even have that kind of on the go. You can share it with your coach or, with your dietitian or something like that to be able to give this information. So it's nice to have this stuff stored electronically if you think you'll be sharing it, or if it's the kind of stuff that maybe you want to be able to total up your mileage that you covered over the course of a training plan and, be able to look back and reflect and maybe do something with that data as you go forward. So that's why, when, and how, and where we're going to want to keep a training log. Like I said, I think it's tremendously valuable. I think that just having that data collection process is something that is so helpful for being able to reflect back, to be able to look for patterns, and then make decisions about how we train going forward, what we do differently, what did we learn, what went well, what didn't go well. After we finish up a race, all of that can feel like a blur. And we risk repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again if we don't have some place that we've been collecting our thoughts and sort of collecting some of the challenges along the way. So what do we do with a training log when we're done with that race training cycle? You look at it. You have to look back at it. You have to use it to make decisions. What I don't want to see people doing is spending a lot of time making their training log, keeping their training log, following all these instructions, making this complicated spreadsheet, and then never looking at it ever again, never reflecting on it, never taking a look back at it, never using it to kind of fuel what happens next and using it to make decisions about what happens next. So don't be that runner who spends a ton of time making the log and then you just never open that notebook ever again, or you throw it out or you delete the spreadsheet or whatever. It's something that we want to continue to be able to reflect on and go back to so that we can continue to grow and develop and evolve as runners. Now, there are times though when we're going to want to not bother to keep a training log. So there is a time and a place where a training log may not be super helpful and actually might cause us a little bit more angst and discomfort, and maybe isn't going to be super valuable. So one of the times that we don't need to keep a training log is when we're in our off season. So we're post race, we've got some downtime. I highly recommend listening to the episode on your off season to understand more about why you need to take an off season and why an off season is such a necessary part of becoming a better runner. So during your off season, I don't really recommend keeping much of a training log because, we don't want to have a ton of structure. We're not looking to have a plan that we're following. We're just kind of keeping it very low maintenance, very low time requirement, and just being a little bit more, easy breezy with things. So to have a log that you're keeping of like all your mileage and all your nutrition and all your info and stuff like that, it can still feel like you're following a training plan and it can still feel like you're in a training cycle. So during your off season, I would just take a break, and rather than having it be like an ongoing continuous training log that just like month after month and week after week, you've got all this data that's just ongoing, keep your training log in like separate race cycles. So like, okay, this is my training log for this marathon that I ran. This is my training log for this 10K that I did. This is my training log for this race. So it's separate. You can still look back at it, maybe have it in like one spreadsheet document, but it's not just this sort of running tab of everything you're doing with your running forever and ever as long as you live. It's a lot of work to keep up and to maintain. And it can be really cumbersome to reflect back and try to think like, okay, when did I do this? When did I start this training cycle? What was the week? Oh, wait, I was on vacation. When did this happen? To keep it all straight. So to just have it start and stop during your race phases, I think is really helpful. And then to just give yourself a break from the tracking when you are not actively kind of preparing for something. During your base building phase is definitely when we can start to keep track again and start up that training log again. And this is, of course, not going to be as intense or have maybe as much data about some of your workouts as the training log for the race cycle is going to have. But, it's still good to kind of start to keep track of things, especially if you've had issues that you're trying to sort of rectify or resolve before you really start ramping it up for your next race cycle. So that's kind of, when there is maybe not a time and a place for keeping a training log as opposed to maintaining one. And get a little bit more information about what sort of information we want to see there. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode, found it helpful to just understand a bit more about what a training log even is, why I think it's a good idea for you to have one, and the different types of information that is really helpful to be able to put into it to keep track of what's going on with your running. Again, data collection is only valuable if we actually do something with it. So if you're collecting information just for the sake of collecting it, it's not helpful to you. It's not helpful to anybody. So make sure that if you're going to go through the process of keeping and maintaining a training log, you've actually, set aside some time and sort of made it a priority to go back and look at it and reflect on it. And then, like I said, use it to make decisions going forward. That's it for today's episode, all about keeping a training log. I want to thank you so much for spending a few minutes with me today, listening and hopefully learning some valuable information. We will catch you in next week's episode. Bye for now. The information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not to be used or relied upon for the diagnosis or treatment of any health condition. This information does not create a client-practitioner relationship and should not be used as a substitute for professional medical advice.